seem for most people that are watching this like that it would be something that is that interesting. But I actually consider it a very interesting topic, and I'll tell you why in a few seconds. And it's really, in my opinion, right now, one of the most important topics that people should be learning about as they're considering remote versus hybrid versus in-office work. And the reason is because it can have profound implications on the success of law firms and also the success of attorneys. And I'll start off by telling you just a couple of quick stories. The first is that Yahoo is a company that, is still in business, but is having quite a few, is not anywhere near, it's a shell of what it used to be. They were one of the first law firms to go, or companies to go remote and fully remote pretty much. And when I think it was Marissa Meyer came in, she tried to order everyone back into work. And this is even way before COVID. And basically she believed that a lot of the problems at Yahoo were because of people working remotely. And what does that mean? That means that it's very difficult to have teamwork. It's people aren't always reliable, that they're working when they say they are. A lot of information that would normally be shared in person meetings doesn't happen. And just a lot of other things can happen. And so there was a whole kind of discussion, this is way before COVID, about the benefits to companies of it. And her conclusion was, and a lot of people that were studying at the time, was that remote is actually something that can hurt employers, and for a lot of different reasons. And then the other thing is for law firms is if you're an employee of a law firm and you're working remotely, there's all sorts of problems as well. One of the things that occurs to me is every time I'm talking to a very successful attorney that's doing very well in kind of a satellite office of a law firm where the decisions are made in the main office, generally, in order for them to make partner, a lot of times, these are in the most competitive firms, they need to go and spend significant time in the main office. And that logic has existed for as long as I've done this. I've been doing this over 20 years. And the idea is that you need that face-to-face contact. You need to be able to develop relationships. And if you don't get that can be very harmful and you won't advance. And so that's always been the way people think about it. And a lot of big firms that don't have remote. And I do think that if you're not in the office, it's much easier to lay you off. It's much easier to assume you're not working. And there's quite a few problems with it. And it can definitely hurt your career. So what I'm going to talk about today is the advantages and the disadvantages of remote and in-office work. It's very relevant to your success as an attorney to understand what you're giving up and what your career trajectory will look like if you try to do remote work. We have a lot of firms, by the way. I've seen this increasingly over the past few years. We have firms where people are working remotely at a current job, they interview them, and then they learn that they're working remotely and they want nothing more to do with the person. They say, this is over. And these are big firms, we don't want anything, we expect this person to be in the office. And the idea is once you start working remotely, you view it as an entitlement. And a lot of people after COVID did. And then you're always a little bit upset if you have to go into the office and you don't like it. And so employers almost view it, a lot of them, if you're working remotely and you've been used to that, they view that as a negative. So it's also something that you need to, not all employers do, of course, but it's also something that you need to be very careful of because it can actually impact offers, it can impact interviews, it can impact a lot of stuff. Now, some firms, of course, like remote work, and there's lots of advantages to it, which are it can lower their costs. For example, law firms are a traditional buyer of a renter of large blocks of office space in major cities. And when they've started renewing leases, they're in many cases getting 25% of the space. So they can actually lower their cost. But then the question becomes the productivity, it becomes meeting with clients, it becomes all these things that we're going to talk about today. There's obviously been a dramatic increase in remote work and hybrid work environments, and it really has altered the way that people practice. And obviously, it's important to understand the differences of these. So remote work basically is where you can work outside of the office. Usually you can work from home. And in many cases, you can even work out of state or out of the country. During COVID, and actually even now, a lot of people work remotely. and they might have a job in New York paying $400,000 a year and then live in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was some other place where they want to be. There's some people even will move to Miami and that sort of thing. And it's very interesting, and it does produce a lot of dilemmas for firms, because if somebody is living in a lower cost environment, what's the point of the higher salary and the higher cost market? And then hybrid work involves basically working remotely and in office. This is very common for firms to do this, and they may require you to be in the office 1 day a week. Some are 2, some are 3. A lot of them will give you Monday and Friday off. And it's not just because the associates want it, it's also because the partners and the staff want it. And then traditional in-office work is having people come into the office and work full-time at the physical location. And it's very interesting. When I used to work in law firms, I would always try to be the first person there and the last person to leave after the partners I was working for left, because invariably, if I was the last person there, they would stop by and chat about things, and they would see me there working when they left and like it. And there's not that sort of thing necessarily going on when you're working remotely. And so each of these ways of working has different challenges and benefits from both the job seeker side and the law firm perspective. And really what I'm most interested in showing you today I'm certainly going to talk about the good reasons for working remotely and the benefits, but also I'm very concerned with the negative benefits, because you have to look at the negative benefits from the perspective of the law firm. And then you also have to look at the negative benefits from your perspective and how it could potentially impact your employment going forward. And you're able to become partner or advance or get clients and all this sort of thing. Job seekers definitely value flexibility. They like work-life balance. They want to be able to progress. And certainly society is changing in terms of the demands and the type of work attorneys want to do. So having a remote or hybrid work environment can certainly allow you to do that. And I think there's a lot of benefits to it. One of the things that I actually like about it a lot is when I was working in law firms, I just hated all the politics. There's so much politics in offices. And when you're part of going to the office every day, that politics is just all over. Certain partners are working in silos, certain associates are working in silos, certain people are in and out, and you don't have to tolerate that as much when you're working remotely. And also the other thing that's pretty cool is if the law firm is a remote firm, and there are a lot, you can apply to firms all over your state. And in some cases, if you're like a patent attorney, you can apply where it's important just to have a national, be part of the patent and trademark office. You can apply nationally or even internationally. There's lots of benefits to being able to have more places to apply and more places to work. And there's also a lot of benefits to law firms having more markets to draw people from and more markets to have the work done. But again, you have to understand the negatives of this, and really those are building professional relationships, securing promotions, and receiving immediate and comprehensive feedback. In a law firm, when you're going to the office each day, you'll go out with people after work. You'll go out for lunch. You'll stop by and talk to people around the office for a half hour, an hour. You'll learn rumors. You'll learn who's doing well and who's not. And all that information can be very important for you in order to get ahead. And there's 2 paths to success in a law firm, and people do it in different ways. One is doing very good work, and one is being very good politically. And some people are good at one and not the other. Some people are good at both, but those are 2 paths to power. So if you feel like you're very good politically, you're going to have a much harder time getting ahead in a law firm if you're remote. It's your benefit is to work in firms where you can work remotely. And then law firms also like being able to be productive. They like, if you are productive, they like overhead cost. They like being able to get more people to work there. And to the extent they want to have team cohesion, data security. It's interesting, as law firms give more freedoms to people and trust people more to work, what ends up happening is more people want to work there, and they can actually attract better talent, because it's more appealing to people. An example would be the law firm that I first started out at was one of the few law firms, this is a long time ago, that had no dress code. Unless you had to go to court or something, you could show up in shorts and sandals, and people did, and t-shirts. And that was considered very cutting edge. You could not have to wear a suit. And it was the first firm in the country to do this, and which is very funny. We're not talking about that long ago, 25 years or 20. Anyway, but there were articles about them in all sorts of newspapers and magazines that they were allowing this. And then they were also one of the first to allow people to go 100% remote. And that's something obviously that probably helped them continue to attract good talent that was attracted by an absence of rules. So it can be very good for the law firm. It can also be good for people, especially if they're very talented. And of course, the savings and being able to tap into a greater talent pool. If I was an attorney and I knew that I wasn't going to practice law for the rest of my career or practice in a law firm, I probably would be very excited about working remotely. And literally, I would seek out firms where I could do that. So it's a consideration depending on the type of law that you want to practice in the long run. Because if your goal, and you know it, is to go in-house, or your goal is to work in the government, or your goal is to make money for a few years and then do something else, then it would be very good for you to do that if you didn't want to benefit from the relationships and so forth that you would develop if you were in a remote firm. I have seen, to the extent we've allowed people in our company to work remotely, there are drops in productivity. People play games, and so it's funny to watch, but for kind of line employees, and we have, 150 people working here and of all different salary levels, but we install, and they know it, software in their computers that monitors their productivity. And so people try to game that by having machines that automatically tilt their mouse every 10 minutes or switch pages, and the software picks up on that. But the more that working remotely, the more games like that you'll see. And just this transition is not just about changing where it gets done, but it's how it gets done. And you suddenly will have fewer face-to-face interactions, fewer schedules, a clear separation, a less clear separation from work and home. And when I'm talking to people that are working remotely, I hear dogs barking, I see people walk in, and it's not always the best thing. Employers think of that. And then it also is a way to get opportunities as well. We'll talk about that. One thing that we're doing in our forms, we have sign-up forms when law firms come and give us jobs. And then we also have forms when candidates submit their resume. We'll start, I think in the next week or so, asking people what kind of employment they're interested in, and then asking employers what type of employees are interested in. So it would be obviously remote, hybrid, or traditional. And that'll be interesting to see that. And we'll have basically a breakdown of 25,000 plus firms to allow people to know that. And then we'll start putting that on their firm bios and doing things like that. I'm just trying to give you a balanced perspective of this so you can understand how it can help you and how it can hurt you. And I'll go into that. And then really all of this is about kind of your preferences, the firm culture, and the nature of the work. And all of these things can play a part in terms of your ability to do well working remotely. There's a lot of people that are much better off working remotely, and a lot of firms that are probably much better off having remote employees. And so it's not necessarily all negative, and it's something that you need to consider. So remote work is, from your perspective, the employee is meaning you have increased job opportunities. So law firms that have remote work arrangements are very open to people from different markets, and there's no geographic limitations. I'll just tell you a quick story that's cool. Years ago, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, actually longer than that, like 5 or 6 years ago, I emailed every firm in the country, and I just said, are you interested in, we have all these candidates in different practice areas. Would you be interested in someone that might not be in your market to come into your office or to work remotely on different matters? And I got a lot of responses, and it was very interesting because a lot of those people had been out of work for a long time because they were isolated by their market. Literally, if you want to work remotely and you're having a hard time finding a job in your practice area, wow, what a great opportunity to take your legal experience and contact firms. And the firms that were most interested in these kind of people tended to be in smaller markets, not large markets, and not smaller to medium-sized markets. So the majority, just basically things outside the top 50 largest cities. And so you do have a lot of opportunities, and a lot more opportunities to work remotely, but you need to understand what you do. So what you do is you don't just apply to firms in your market, you start applying to others. And especially if you're in a practice area where there's not a lot of people, which would be you kind of niche practice areas. I would say trademarks a niche practice area, patent is a niche practice area, environmental law. There's all sorts of different niche practice areas. So this is a huge benefit. I don't know how much to stress it to you, but you need to start looking at firms in all sorts of markets and all over your state, for one. That's probably the easiest. So instead of just planning to try to work in one city in your state, you can apply to firms all over the state. And you can tell them, especially if you're a very qualified attorney, whether it's in corporate or litigation or tax, you can tell the firms that I'm in this other market. I'm willing to work remotely. And if things work out, I might consider in the future moving there, or you don't even have to say that. And it gives you a tremendous ability to increase the number of places you're going to work. And so everyone has to get out of this mindset that you only need to apply to markets where you're interested in. By allowing people through our company to apply to multiple markets, they get far more interviews. I mean, by a factor of obviously not 50, because there's some markets that are very small, but they get a lot more interviews than they normally would get by applying to a lot of markets. And so you can also apply to a lot of markets. You can also apply to firms that have your practice area, even if they don't have jobs. So you can apply to, this is one of the ways that people get positions all the time. They apply to firms that don't have jobs, and then they end up getting hired because the firm needs someone like that. And so if you're able to do this in geographic areas where there's not a lot of people like you, think of the massive rewards and the massive amount of ways you can get jobs now that firms are open to remote people. Very helpful. The other thing is you get a lot of work-life balance. It's much easier to get up and start working at a computer and at home than it is to drive 1 hour to work each way. It's much easier to exercise if you want to at lunch or in the morning and then go into the office. It's much easier to go to lunch. All of these things, it's much easier to not have to pay for parking. It's great. There's all sorts of benefits to it. And back to the job opportunities, you can make money and more money in other markets than you might be making in your markets. These are great benefits. And obviously, from my perspective, another benefit is also you don't have to participate as directly in office politics. You're just working remotely. You're doing the best job you can. In the average office, people spend an hour or two per day, and this is including legal offices, just talking to associates about different matters. And if you're working in a remotely, you don't have that whole interruption's gone, and your whole interruption of driving is gone. And you can save money by doing things like walking the dog and not paying someone to do it, being at home when your kids are there. There's tons and tons of benefits to working remotely. The cons are really, I believe, is that you're going to have potentially a negative career impact. And these face-to-face interactions, I believe, are incredibly important to being able to form relationships with superiors and being seen for the work you're doing. They make you less human because you're not interacting with people. They're just seeing the results, your hours, and they also make, for people that are bad at politics or people that are good at politics, they lessen the importance of that. So what do I mean by being good at politics? I mean that there are people that are very good at forming relationships and getting work from people that may not be as talented as people that could do a better job. There are people that are very good at making themselves look good at the expense of others. There are people that are very good at undermining competition. There are people that are very good at boosting the ego of people that are important and getting advanced based on that. And so you can play, these political games are a major part of most law firms, which people don't understand all the time going into it. They're a huge part. People will walk around and say things to undermine there's all sorts of games that are going on. If you are good at politics, which a lot of people are, and lawyers are as a general rule, then you're not going to be able to use that aspect of your personality. And so that actually, for a lot of people, would be a con. For attorneys that aren't good at politics, it's actually a pro. But the other thing is it's isolating. You're not interacting with people. This could lead to feelings of isolation, disconnection. It can actually lead to psychological problems. They talk about the things that people are most happy with in life. And really, it's not material goods. It's not how much money you make. If you buy something or get a promotion, you might feel good about it for a few days. But really, the most happiness comes from our relationships with other people. That's most of it. It's 90%. If you look at people that are very depressed or having really psychological problems, it's often just because they don't have those kind of relationships. And so if you are in a position where you're out of the office and not forming those relationships, it can cause problems. It can cause a lot of very serious problems, especially if you're not going to be necessarily making friends at work. Every firm that I've ever been in, attorneys had very good friendships with attorneys at work. People dated and got married, the people they met at the office. There's all sorts of benefits. And I'm not saying that's the right thing, but there's all sorts of benefits of working in an office you're not necessarily going to get. And so all these negativities are very important for you to understand, because they can have very serious negative problems. And also, that in addition to the isolation, it's the lack of information and that you're not getting from your peers. And it's a lack of understanding if there's problems in your firm or where the opportunities lie, because you're not going to get that working remotely. So from the law firm's perspective, they do having more people that can work there. They like the ability to hire people from different markets. They like the idea of not being held hostage by people in their own market. That also gives them the ability to pay people less if they want. And it really also, so there's a lot of pros from their perspective. It also lowers their overhead costs. As I told you earlier, offices that are coming up for renewal, law firms are taking out far less space. It's not funny, but it's interesting that now there's a huge crisis in the office market. And in Los Angeles, there's been, I don't know, $2 million or $2 billion in loan defaults in just since the past 3 months. It's huge because interest rates are up and law firms and other employers that are a big source of rents are not renting places anymore. That's very serious. And so law firms like the low overhead cost. Obviously, they can make a lot more money if they don't have to pay for offices. And then the other one is just employees are often happier working remote. All of the drawbacks of working in an office for some people, which include the politics, the driving, the needing to put on pants and a button-down shirt for work, all that's gone, and people can be much happier. It can potentially improve morale. It can also lower staff turnover because a lot of people quit firms when other people disapprove of them or don't say hi to them in the halls, or they feel like they have things that they don't know. And that's actually a real benefit. They concentrate more on revenue generating activity, which is billing, and less on other things. And so the work quality and amount they get can be more. The cons are that there's less teamwork. There's less face-to-face interaction. There's less sitting around a conference table and going through things. There's less information being exchanged. The firm brand, to some extent, can weaken because people are not working face to face, and all of the political and other ways that shape the way people are, it goes away. I'd like to tell a story that this is years ago, but you can often tell just by the way people behave and dress the type of firm they're at. Different firms have different brands. They have different types of people that work there. And it does create, individual firms do have a certain personality that they hire. Or if you're not quite that personality, you often become that type of personality. So it was funny. I was on plane years ago, 2 planes, and going to Los Angeles, and I saw one attorney working, and I said to myself, I bet this woman is at a firm called Manat, because people work on planes. And so I asked her, and she was at Manat. And then, I don't know, a year or 2 later, I was on another plane, and I saw someone working, and based on just clues with dress, the intensity, the way the person was working, I said, I bet this person is at either Arnold and Porter, and I don't remember the other firm. And turned out the person was at Arnold and Porter. So this kind of stuff, like the firms have personalities, the attorneys have personalities, and there's a brand that's created. And you're talking to someone that does nothing but study law firms and has been doing it and its people for decades. So I'm not saying that my ability to spot this stuff is perfect or even 75%, but I do have a sense of the type of people that work at different firms. And so you lose that brand from the firm's perspective if people are working at home. And then you also have all sorts of confidentiality issues and risk related to data security and client confidentiality. One of the things that a lot of people don't know, but I'll just come out and say it. When I was worked in a New York law firm, and the firm is no longer in business, but I worked in a New York law firm my second summer of law school, and it was a big firm. And one day there was a closet, like a kind of a big closet down the hall from me, and people used to shuffle in and out of there during the day, and sometimes partners would come up to it, and with a person they'd unlock it and go in there. And one day I walked by and it was open, and there was a guy in there, and I was like, "What is this?" And he said, "Oh, these are just recorders." And I was like, "What are you doing in there? Do you record the attorneys?" And he goes, "You're a summer associate, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "No, they're not recording you." And so it was funny because I don't know if they were recording phone, but there's a lot of oversight that happens in firms. Now, I don't know if that kind of stuff exists anymore, and this is before a lot of privacy things, but law firms do monitor people's screens when you're there. They do all sorts of things to make sure things are kept confidential, and they do take it very seriously. This is a couple of years ago. I encountered someone that had been fired from one of the biggest New York law firms, and they've been fired because they posted some bad comments about the firm on Above the Law or I don't know where it was, something like that. But they did it without putting their name. And then within a couple hours, the firm found out who it was because they did it on their work computer and fired the person. So law firms, and this is not a privacy issue, and I don't know how much that still goes on, but when you're in an office, law firms have to be very careful with client information, and watching this stuff could cause some problems for them. And I don't know that it's that serious, but it's just something to keep in mind. But from your perspective, if you're an attorney, working in an office is something outside, not in an office, is something that could help you. And then hybrid work is, I think, the best of both worlds. It allows you to go into the office and work where other people are there. And some firms will stagger it and have a semi-permanent office. It potentially provides you the best of both worlds because you can clear your head when you're working at home. And then when you go into the office, you're more enthusiastic and try to build relationships. You can still network with people, and that can help you a great deal with your career by being able to go in and network in person. And then it still offers you the kind of flexibility that you may want with working in the office. The negativities are it blends space, and people may not be comfortable having to pick up and move a few days a week. It also can be expensive. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but certainly if you're in a major city where housing is extremely expensive, you do have to have a separate office, hopefully, where you're doing your work. And then you have to factor the cost of that into account, as well as commuting back and forth to work. If you're fully remote, you don't have to bear the transportation cost of even having a car. You could maybe have one car in your household as opposed to two. There's quite a few benefits to that. And then the change of the environment can be inconsistent. What a lot of firms have done is they start off saying, "Oh, we want to do it hybrid 1 day a week," and then they go to 2, and then they go to 3. So you never know once a firm starts doing that, what's going to happen. Law firms do feel that having a hybrid remote can improve retention and give people more flexibility and in the ability to have time with their family, at least a physical presence there. It also can allow face-to-face interactions, and then it also reduces the operational cost. One thing to consider, this is a factor in your calculus as an employee if you're trying to work remotely, is you suddenly have an extra cost because you have to have a quiet office. So the law firm is pushing off on you that expense of maintaining an office in your home while not necessarily compensating you for it directly, except in other ways, which would be the ability to be in your house and not have to drive and other things. Then the problem for law firms is also that it becomes much more complex to manage scheduling, things that need to happen in the office and communication. And then people, there's still could be disparities, which I don't think is that big a deal. And then there can be equivalent overhead cost to having a fully in place group of attorneys in the office, meaning they still have to maintain offices, and some firms will actually maintain the same office space while allowing people to work remotely. And then, of course, there's full-time office work, which I think to discuss this is very important because this is what a lot of people do. And you need to understand that. The pros of that are it's much easier to see your progression and the growth opportunities. When you're in the office, you're getting information from people. You're also getting immediate feedback. So if somebody doesn't like your work or they need a problem, they'll say, I'll talk to you in a few minutes, or you can walk into an office and get feedback, and as opposed to working remotely where you might only talk to a superior once a week and schedule times. And so it's much more difficult. The other type of feedback I think that is also important is from your junior associate, from senior associates, or mid-level associates. If you're mid-level, from senior associates, that can be important as well. And then the other thing that I think is extremely important is the separation of your work and personal life. So if you're working at home, you may have people stopping in your home office consistently, just as you would if you're working in an office, but it becomes a little bit difficult to balance these two things. Because imagine if one of your children needs something, and imagine if your spouse you are having an argument. All these things become less blurred. And in addition, when you leave the office, it's not the case for a lot of attorneys, but when you leave the office, you can just not take the work with you. But if you are working at home, there's not as much of a boundary, and you associate your home with work as opposed to a place to relax and spend time with your family. And then the negatives, of course, are there's obviously limited flexibility. The schedules are more fixed, and the location can affect the balance, meaning you may have spent a lot of time traveling, your costs related to commuting, insurance, having to have clothes that are presentable and higher when you'll have to go out to eat usually, so your food's more expensive. And then you're also limited to the geography you're in or what's close to your house. Like Los Angeles, you have two areas. You have West LA, and then you have where people try to work in firms in Century City and in Santa Monica. And then you have downtown that draws people typically from a different area of the city. So it's almost, there's two cities in one. People that are on the west side would almost never consider working downtown, and vice versa. You're limited in the number of places you can work. And that can obviously mean fewer opportunities, mean that it's much more difficult to work in other firms. Law firms, this ease of collaboration, a lot of firms will just not even think about remote, and they've gone back to full because it's part of their brand. They think that it gives them higher quality service to their clients, and they just won't even consider the idea of remote. And it's interesting because these sorts of the firms that do it are usually the same firms, the very best firms, and have cultures that really value in-person relationships. It can be a very good thing. Also, they have oversight, so they know who's working and who's not working. I can tell you that I've hired attorneys that have worked remotely, and often they will take meetings in cars. They're not reachable, or they forward their work phone to their cell phone, so they pick it up and try to sound like they're at work, but it's been forwarded because I can. And so it's from a firm's perspective, you have to wonder, are they getting the same level of productivity? They're not seeing people in the office, so they don't know if you're really working. They also don't know your work style. So do you sit down and work very intently and aggressively, or are you screwing around and still billing hours? And they don't know. And then of course, I don't think there's cost savings from the remote work infrastructure. I disagree with that, but at the same time, there's a little bit of cost associated with it. And then the other one is obviously there's costs associated with maintaining an office and its facilities. And there's just a lot of costs that go with that. If you think about it, you have computers, you have people having to maintain computers at the office, you have people vacuuming every day and cleaning the offices, you have security, you have all sorts of things. And so it's obviously very expensive for law firms to maintain offices. You have receptionists, you have all these people doing things that you wouldn't necessarily need in a remote environment. And then they have a talent pool, meaning they can only draw people from the region that they're in. One of the reasons that law firms like to locate in big central cities is because it's easier to attract talent in a market like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, being in that city. It's also easier to meet with clients if you have to do in-person meetings, but it's actually much easier to get talent because there's always a lot of people in major markets that are doing work there. And so if a law firm has an opening, they can generally attract a huge number of applicants to work in their office. And that's why they tend to be in larger cities. And then another con would be the flexibility. There's not as much flexibility for people, and that can create issues. Okay, and then this is an important one, and I will, by the way, be taking questions, and this is a live webinar. We'll get to those in a few minutes, but answering interview questions, law firms are going to ask about it. They're going to ask what you think about it, and you should know going into the interview. Many interviews now are set up remotely, but you should know going into the interview what the firm does. You should try to figure that out right away, because a huge mistake is assuming if the law firm is remote or not remote, that you can convince them to hire you remotely. If a law firm doesn't hire remotely or has an in-office policy, they again are not going to like that. Now, if you are working remotely and the law firm does have remote type of work, then you need to highlight your past experience. You need to say, I billed 1,800 hours when I was working in the office because I had to commute and all this stuff. And now I'm billing 2,200 hours because I have more time. I feel like I'm doing better because I can concentrate. Whatever the reasons, you need to highlight that it's a benefit for you to work remotely if you're asked about it. But you need to know going into interviews what the firm's doing. Again, I can't tell you how many interviews I've seen blown by people saying they want to work remotely when the law firm doesn't hire remotely. The law firm is thinking about going to a hybrid or in-office employment situation. The reason is because people treat working remotely as a benefit or a fringe benefit of the job that shouldn't be taken away. If you get a raise, people never think it should be taken away. Well, a lot of times people are now taking working remotely as a benefit that should never be taken away. So law firms don't want to take the risk of hiring someone where that's a requirement, but they think it's necessary, because why would they? The odds are, if it's important you work remotely and you take a job in a firm where you have to go in, you're going to take another job if you can work remotely. So it's a huge risk for them hiring people that want to work remotely, because it also shows that it may be difficult to control you once you get there. Law firms want to hire people that they believe will go there and be controllable and do what's asked of them and not have sour grapes if they're working remotely. So on your resume, if you're working in an office, I believe that you can mention it on your resume, but you don't have to, but you can often mention that you're working remotely if you're applying to firms that are remote, but you have to be very careful about that again. And again, I can't stress enough understanding your audience. If you don't understand your audience, you're going to get into trouble. I saw recently, we had a big firm in Texas that had made an offer to someone, and they had a Texas address on the resume, but then the law firm called them to come in to do something related to the offer. I don't remember what it was. And the person said, I've been working in, I don't know where it was, Miami or some city, some kind of fun city like that, or San Diego. And the law firm revoked the offer because they felt it was misrepresentation for the person to have a Texas address when they really were living in another city. So you have to be careful with this kind of stuff. And you need to give firms the impression that if you need to, that you're actually in the market and not there. So you need to understand your audience. And again, there's also all sorts of relocation opportunities. A lot of firms will allow remote in big cities. And, if you're in New York, you could potentially live very far out in Long Island and do all sorts of things if you're working remotely and get the same salary. But again, it's going to depend on the firm and your skills. There's certain types of attorneys that have always been very popular, that where remote has been more popular than others. One of them is patent law. Like a lot of patent attorneys I've seen allowed to work at home really for a long time, for way before COVID. Yeah, let's dive a little bit deeper into this. Just let me see, a remote job. Yeah, talked a little bit about that, legal jobs. So these are some of the legal jobs that are often most suitable for remote work, which should, things that someone does. And again, intellectual property and cyber law are two that tend to happen. And so that can work. Obviously, everyone's aware of the different softwares and things that can be used. And we talked about some of these cons already. And again, the pros, more job opportunities, which talked about remote work, often a lot of opportunities in the legal field. So I did talk about this earlier, but I really do want to emphasize it because I think a lot of people, when you're looking at jobs on job sites, when you're applying to jobs through recruiters, when you're mailing resumes, a lot of times people think, I want to work in this city, I want to work in that city, but really the whole market is open to you. This is what's so nice about this is there's lots and lots of unemployed attorneys. It's 1.4 million or whatever, 1.6 million attorneys in the country. At any one time, several 100,000 of them are unemployed. So being able to apply to firms all over your state, which you should do, is a huge benefit. And you can get multiple offers doing this, as opposed to just sticking with one market. And so that's why at BCG, we're going to this kind of thing where we're identifying all the remote firms and then helping people apply to them remotely, which is just awesome. And then you can apply all over the country. And even in some cases, I've seen people in the US working on documents like project finance and international arbitration, and for firms and corporate securities and firms in the UK and Dubai and all sorts of places that they wouldn't be able to they would have to move to a foreign country. And the most beneficial is if you want to live in a smaller market. It used to be if you're from a smaller market and you wanted to work in a big city or for a firm that paid a lot in a big city or a firm that did very sophisticated work, you would have to actually live in that city. And I do want to give you a couple of examples of the benefits of working in large markets if you're in a small market, or if you're able to move want to move to a small market. The benefit is that most firms, when you get into smaller markets, will have more generalists than specialists. Your smaller to mid-sized markets, if someone is like a corporate attorney, they're probably going to be general corporate. They'll do M&A, they'll do securities, they'll do whatever comes across, whatever the firm has. Whereas in a larger market, you can be more specialized. So there's actually career benefits if you're in a smaller market of working on matters in a large market, because you become much more specialized, and that specialization can lead to the ability to get more clients and that specialist to charge higher rates and to make a lot more money in the future. I don't know that I've adequately explained that, but I'll just give you an example. If somebody needs a sophisticated securities attorney, most of the time that securities attorney is going to come from a law firm in a big city, probably New York, but also Palo Alto. Maybe if there's some firms in Chicago that do it, but there's in Houston and Dallas, but most of the time they're going to come from a big market. But securities attorneys, like very good ones, are always in demand. You can, even as a senior securities attorney, you can usually find something in a law firm or in-house, whereas a general corporate attorney is going to have more general experience, which is going to be less employable in large law firms. Their billing rate's not going to be as high most of the time because they're not specialized like a securities attorney is. And therefore, their salary will often be, or the amount they can make in the future will often be limited. And by not having a specialty, that can actually do some harm to them, and it will limit opportunities. It will open up the number of clients they can get, but it will limit the clients to people that are interested in generalists and not specialists, which tends to be in smaller to mid-sized markets. The idea that you can work in a lot of different markets is pretty awesome and gives you the ability to apply to places. It's also gives you a lot of flexibility. Different people have biological or clocks or that where they do things differently. If you're not in a firm that requires you to be online at certain times and is just more interested in your hours, you can do things like stay up till 3 a.m. working on something and then get up at 11 or 12 and take some time and then get up again. And so you can work the hours you want as long as you're billing that time. And that's very useful to a lot of people. Some people would prefer to be ready for when their kids get out of school at 2, so they start work at 5, whatever. You can do the schedule you want, and that gives you a lot of flexibility, which is pretty cool for a lot of people, and really makes the job more suited to you as opposed to the other way around. And it can be very beneficial to people who are parents, and like I said earlier, and it gives them the ability to work with their kids and everything more effectively. And then it saves a lot of time, which they can use for all sorts of things. Major cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, the traffic is horrible. I've seen attorneys that work in Fort Worth and live in Dallas spend an incredible amount of time commuting each day. And you can, obviously you don't have to do that. And then we talked about the cost savings and then wardrobe. You can do whatever you want. We talked about the food expenses, and then the ability to work in remote locations, and literally live in places with a much lower cost of living and even a better climate. So all this stuff can be very helpful and improve the quality of your life dramatically. A lot of the things, it's going into work and at a certain time. A lot of this stuff was developed almost in tandem with people working in factories. The same thing with kind of schools, where a society needed to put everyone at the same level. And it's very interesting when you study this stuff, but the idea of being able to work remotely means that your life can be very much improved. And for a lot of people, it can be very attractive. And then let me just see here, a couple more of these. And then we talked about some of the drawbacks, but I just want to make sure I talk about a few more. It can actually have a very bad career progression, career results for you. And it can be much more difficult to become a partner and to advance than it would otherwise be if you were in the office. So in order to explain that to you a little bit better, I want you to understand the way a law firm views an associate, like a junior associate, and as you get more senior, how they view a senior associate. So the long and short of it is, if you're hired at a law, and we're not talking about all law firms, but most law firms, and most law firms in large cities, if you're hired as an associate there, you're taking a risk in working in big law firms, because a lot of what you're doing is you're front loading your compensation earlier in your career. And what do I mean by that? I mean that your odds of becoming a partner are not that great, but they will be great if you make the right connections, you develop relationships with certain people, you have sponsors that have business that are willing to get behind you when you come up for partner. And there's all sorts of reasons that it's very important to work in an office. If you're not working in an office, you don't necessarily have that, but the law firms are okay with that. The reason is because they need people at the junior level to work a lot and hopefully not have any expectations of advancement for 8 to 10 years or maybe longer. And so you're fulfilling the purpose of being a billing machine, which is just how the business works. But in order to move beyond that business, being a billing machine, and to become a partner and to learn to generate business and stuff, in most cases, you're going to need to have a mentor. And that mentor hopefully will have a lot of business. And then when it comes time to make you partner, that mentor will sponsor you. And that mentor may have other people that they're close with that you may have done work with sponsor you. And that will help you get ahead. If you're working at home, those relationships that are important are very difficult to make. It's just going to be getting assignments, reporting to people, and the firms are okay with that. They can always find lateral partners. And if you by chance start going out and getting business while you're working at home, that's good too. But these networking opportunities are a huge component of advancing your career. I know multiple people that when it came time to be partnered didn't have sponsors, or their sponsors weren't the right sponsors. And again, that could be curtailed in a remote setup. There's a lot of statistics out there, and I'm not going to get into them, but it's something like 80% of people that have mentors are happier, they make better career decisions, they advance faster and farther, they don't make the same mistakes that people without mentors make. And so when you go to an office, you're actually getting a mentor, and that mentor is hugely important because you cannot play God. Who's your teacher? Who's teaching you how to do things? And if you're just making up rules while you're at home, that's very difficult. But if you're in an office, you're getting all sorts of guidance on a daily basis where you're learning about how this stuff works. And hopefully you find a mentor and someone to help you. Being isolated, as I talked earlier, can really hurt people. So some people do need to have contact with other people, and that's important to them to be successful. It's very funny. I live in this city, Malibu, and there's a lot of, in this city, it can take a while to get to places even like Santa Monica during rush hour. It can take an hour or longer. And so but there's all these people that have office space here. And so you go into these office spaces and they're just single offices. And there's a lot of people that work at home instead of going into an office. And they literally were working at home, and they have these beautiful houses on the ocean and stuff, but instead they go into these offices and work because they get to see other people. And then and they feel stir crazy at home. And being in an office can get rid of those senses of isolation and being disconnected from others. And again, most of your happiness as a person and most people's happiness comes from your interaction with other people. And being in an office just allows you to have a sense of community, and that sort of thing is very important. In caveman times, it's not that important to mention, but it's interesting. Humans were in groups of 40, or they were very small groups. And if you were kicked out of that group, it was almost like you died. So that was been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. And so people genetically, and because living in huge cities and is relatively recent, but you're genetically programmed to be with other people and to get a sense of safety and happiness from that. That's just how it's always been. And this is very important. And if you're in a remote work setup, you don't necessarily get this. Lack of social connection means you're going to feel isolated. Your mental well-being can be affected. Most forms of depression and a lot of psychological problems are caused by not being around other people, and because you get safety and comfort from that. And so being able to spend time with other people is hugely important. And you don't always get that when you're at home, or you're in a relation, or maybe you're completely alone, or I don't know, but you will start acting out and having problems with your significant other. All sorts of things can happen. And so that is something that you really need to be aware of, that if your goal is to be remote, you may have all sorts of things that come up when you're isolated like that. And what is a prison? A prison is a place where people are isolated. And what is solitary confinement? When they put someone in solitary confinement, that's the worst possible thing that can happen in a prison. Solitary confinement means you don't have social interaction. You're alone. And so that's considered the worst possible punishment. So why is that? That's because it is. Being without contact with others is the worst possible punishment. And then feedback is incredibly important too. So whenever a young attorney starts work, and even older ones, there's certain expectations of an employer in terms of the type of work that's necessary, in terms of what they expect. And certain firms will require different things than others. Certain partners will require different work styles than others. And so you need to really get that feedback. And in an office, you can get feedback from people that you may not have any connection to, that have worked with that person in the past and can tell you what to do. You can get leads of people that can help you with things. You can do all sorts of things to get insights into what you should be doing to improve, and you will. It's amazing how work quality can improve based on the contact you have with other people, or how that work quality can go down by not having that feedback. And in a remote environment, not getting that feedback is going to become much harder, and it can make it very difficult for you to improve with your skills and your job performance. And you may not even know why you're not getting work in a remote environment. You may not have anybody to talk to directly. You just may not know. That can create problems. And a lot of times information, when you get important information, it's very informal. It comes through different kind of channels, and you learn things. And I'll just tell you an example. I once was working on a matter with a partner and I don't know, 3 or 4 other people. And there was a girl at my age in a law firm that was getting all these assignments, and I wasn't getting as many. And so I suddenly started feeling a little bit weird. I was like, why aren't I getting work? Am I doing something wrong? And there was another partner that I was friends with, and we were out after work one day. And I remember very well, we were sitting at a sushi bar, and I told him this, and he said, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. And I said, why? And he just said something to the effect, he didn't say it directly, but he said that partner has more of a relationship with this person than you realize, meaning they were having a relationship. And at that point, I wasn't sad anymore. But had I not known about that and felt in trouble for not getting work, I would have potentially quit. Who knows? I was very upset. And that can create problems too. I saw someone raise their hand, and I will take questions at the end. I just want to run through this. And then again, the time management challenges can be difficult, meaning you at different times, you may have a difficult time at home managing your time, and that also can create problems. Okay, and then I talked about this earlier, but just when you're working at home, you're always feeling like you're at work, and that can create, even when you're not in the office, it can create lots of problems for you because you feel like you need to always work, and that's not good. And because you may suddenly believe you can work 7 days a week. I don't know. Just as an aside for everyone, most religions, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Islam, they all basically have a requirement that you don't work 1 day a week. It's part of the religion, and you do need that to clear your head. And these are things that have been around in some cases for thousands of years. From a law firm's perspective, you have to understand their benefits. We talked about this earlier, which is the expanded talent pool, and law firms can be limited by these geographical restraints. The law firm's job is to hire the best people it can, and by hiring the best people they can, they are able to have very good service to their clients. If they're able to hire people from other geographies that may be very talented than existing people in the market, that's really a big benefit for them. And one of the things is that clients are always looking at the qualifications of the attorneys working on their matters. They're looking at where they worked before, where they went to school, all those sorts of things. And so it can make the law firm much better. And then a law firm with very highly qualified attorneys can attract better clients. Or the law firm could potentially reduce its cost by hiring people from smaller markets where it's not as expensive and still charge high market rates. So there's all sorts of tricks that law firms can use, and I don't call them tricks, but things that benefit them from a business standpoint. And this can also mean that law firms are able to target people that are not available locally. And this is a real problem for a lot of firms. I get calls from firms like in Detroit where they're like, we need a securities attorney, or firms in a small town or a smaller market in Indiana that may need a patent attorney where there's no one available locally. This can really help them. Of course, the overhead cost, one of the biggest costs of law firms is maintaining offices, and then of course, utility expense, that's really pretty obvious. But these sorts of expenses, when they're lowered, can allow the law firm to pay higher salaries or higher profits per partner, or spend more money on talent, getting better talent. And then, of course, a lot of people are much happier working remotely. I've noticed, and this is just from the law firm's point of view, that candidates that are working remotely or attorneys that are working remotely are far less likely to look for jobs because they like that flexibility. So it can also help with retention. One of the greatest expenses of law firms is when, especially large law firms, when large groups of associates start leaving after their first, second, and third year. It's almost a ritual. And if people are working remotely, can definitely reduce that cost. And employees appreciate that, and it can be good as well. And then again, we talked about the work-life balance, and then people that are happier are often more productive and engaged and loyal to their firms. So I did want to just bring up again this kind of political thing I talked about, where someone in a firm I was at had a relationship with a partner had a relationship with another associate that was on the matter that I was at. Obviously, that made me unhappy. If I was working remotely, I never would have known about that. And think about all the things that upset you in a firm when you may be working in the office. And if you're able to get rid of a lot of that stuff, it can be very good for you. And just again, some obstacles for firms are communication barriers. So when a firm's trying to contact someone, many times there's no response. I see all sorts of games with when people that we have work remotely. Sometimes I'll have someone that I typically call every day around 2 or 3. But then if I call them at 4 one day, maybe one day out of 100, they're never there. So I realize that the person is not in the office and the time they're leaving and coming to the office based on that. So that can create problems. And then really being able to go back and forth with meetings and asking questions about things can also be, there's less of that. And then this can help hurt the firm. It can hurt the quality of the work that's being done. And it often may get lost. You can't often communicate effectively in email. When people are writing emails, the tone may not actually match how the person's thinking about things. So people can misinterpret your emails. Law firms can get mad and let people go. I've seen that a lot of times because the email was inappropriate. People may say things differently in person in a way, and these misunderstandings based on the tone of an email or something seemed disrespectful can really get blown out of proportion and relate to a lot of problems. And then this lack of connection could ultimately hurt the cohesiveness of the law firm and impact teamwork and all that sort of thing. And then ultimately lead to decreased morale and hurting the ability of the law firm to get things done. There's people that take remote work seriously, and there's people that don't. I'll tell you one thing that I saw. It's interesting. I've seen people that are able to literally run businesses while working remotely, and then they never would have been able to do that when they're not. I've seen people in big firms do this. I've actually seen people work in a law firm and then another employer at the same time when working remotely. Who's to say, that a brief or something you're writing that could be done in 20 hours that you bill 60 hours on while working another job? I mean, people do play these kind of games. I see it in large people, sometimes in firms of different sizes. And then lawyers really will often worry about that, though people will be paranoid that you're working for, that you won't be there. And that and if you're not around a few times when someone calls or is looking for you, they will presume that maybe you're really not working like you say you're going to. And that can create problems. I remember my first job after law school was with a judge, and sometimes you would need to leave at like noon or 1. And I typically wouldn't talk to him really every day. I'd have lunch with him with the other clerk, but might meet with him formally once a week, if that. And then sometimes when he would leave the office early, he would always call like at 2 or 3 or 5. You never knew, and just say, "Hey, what's going on?" And I'd be like, "Nothing, I'm just working." But he would do that because he would be worried that people would leave. And so employers have that kind of paranoia as well. And if they believe you're not there and not working, they'll often discount it, even if you just got up to get the mail or something. This is a lot of times how they think, and that can impact how the law firm views you and create problems. And then I talked about confidentiality a little bit earlier. I don't think that we need to talk about that matter, the IT. And then the final one is hybrid remote. And then that is obviously really something that's been happening. Job seekers like that. But it can be a negative as well. And here's some of the advantages, I guess, from the standpoint of a job seeker. It can really provide a pretty good balance. And legal employers are also allowed to, employees are allowed to work from home part of the time and on certain days within a traditional office environment. And if you are in a hybrid work arrangement, I think it's something that you should take very seriously. And because I think that I've actually seen people where remote work is optional. And I was talking not too long ago. It was very funny. I was talking to a partner. She was in somewhere in South Florida, and she had a good book of business, and she liked to go in the office. So she really looked forward to going to the office on days where it was hybrid. And I guess it wasn't mandatory hybrid, but she would go in and she'd be in this huge office and there'd only be a couple of attorneys there. And she said, "This just is making it way too difficult for me to get work done. I need that sense of camaraderie and being around other people." And this was one of the reasons she was looking for a job. And so these in-office days are very important. Same for networking. I'm not going to go through all this again because I think everything that I've said so far has been pretty much covered this. Let me just move on with this so we can get to questions. And the cons are really the same as we talked about earlier. So let's go here and move through that. And then let's see, logistical challenges. Okay. And, yeah, let's see. So I'm going to move through hybrid because I think of many of the same points that we covered. And then, yeah, I think we'll cover most of this. Retention, collaboration. Let's see here. Operational cost. Let's see. I don't want to spend too much time on the stuff that we already covered. It's definitely interesting, but covered a lot of it. Logistical. And this is really based on a very long article for law firms too, with their studying this problem. Okay, let's see, partial overhead cost. Here we got that. Okay, and then full-time. These are covered that. The ability to see notable advantages, clear career progression. I talked about that earlier, but I just want you to understand that it's much easier, in my opinion, to advance when you're under a full-time office environment. There's just a lot of clear pathways. You are able to play the political side of the coin as well as the work, and then you can really watch how senior people are handling things. You can watch how they work, you can just get a sense of how things work better in person. And then the networking is incredibly important. We talked about that. And then the immediate feedback from work, not having to wait a week or something to get feedback. You'll often be able to get it very quickly and then become a better attorney. And then all this feedback, I think, is extremely important, and as is criticism. And that can help you as well. And then the separation, I talked about that earlier. And then, of course, the cons, I think we've covered most of those already. So I'm going to move through these, cost you more. And then you have fewer job opportunities if you're just looking for a position in one market. Here. Let's see here, law firm's perspective, same thing. We've covered all that. And then let's see here, oversight. Do that. Savings. This is a very long PowerPoint. I don't want to get too far into this. Right here, higher overhead cost. Wow, look at all this. Increased flexibility. Okay, so conclusions. Again, I don't want to talk too much about the same stuff, but each type of work environment does have unique advantages and disadvantages, and the best choice depends on analyzing all this. You kind of gain my opinion about it, that I do think working in the office is often a lot smarter if you want a long-term career in a law firm. But if you don't, and that's something that you don't want, then if it was me, I certainly would want to work in a remote environment. One of the kind of final points that I think is worth mentioning is, and this is actually a very important point, is one of the reasons that people compete to get in to the best schools, whether it's a top law school or a top college, is because really it's not because there's anything special that's taught. Most schools teach the same thing, and the professors are equally good at most schools. But the reason that it's so competitive to get into these schools is because of the people you're around. If you're in an environment where where you're spending time going to class with people that are very talented and you're interacting with them, you're going to be a different person, because those people are going to share their goals and aspirations with you, and you're going to rise to their level, and you're going to consider those are who you're going to try to be. That's your competition level. You're going to compare yourself to your peers. And this is how most people are. Most people compare themselves to their peers, and depending on how well they've done things, how well their career is going or whatever they're doing, they feel good or bad about each other. If you live in a neighborhood and you're doing better than your peers, you feel better. If you're in people you come out of school with, you're going to compare yourself to them. Being around people has always been considered, you'll rise to their kind of level when you're doing things in person. And this is why people pay all this money to go to schools and why it's so important. It's not because of what you're learning. It's because you become like the people you spend time with. So the problem with remote work, as I see it, is that if you're working remotely, it's almost like attending a university remotely or getting a degree remotely. Yes, you're learning the material, but you're not really benefiting from the in-person interaction and the formation of a peer group that's going to make you a much more effective person. So I look at the careers every day and I see what happens to the people that go to places like Cravath or big firms and very good firms, Latham and Watkins and things. And you look at the people that go to really good firms, and start out there and spend a lot of time there. And then what happens in their career. And honestly, it's the better firm you're in. And if you're in the office, it really does create and make you into a better person in terms of an attorney. And I think a lot of that, and the majority of that, has to do with in-person interaction. Because if you don't get that, then you're really harming yourself. And if I wanted to have a career as an attorney, I would do everything I possibly could to be in a law firm where I was working with other people. The final point that I just want to make is you learn things from people, you rise to the level of your peer group, and you share information, and all that makes you a better person. But one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, and especially young attorneys, is they come out of law school and they think it's a competition to make the most money, or they go to law school because they realize how much money attorneys make. Money is part of it, but really what you're doing your first 5 years of practice is you're essentially going to school again, because you don't learn a practice area and you don't learn how to become an attorney, and you don't get really good at it unless you get instructed by people that are better than you, and you learn things and you learn how to approach problems and to think about things and how people think, and you watch them in person, and you don't get any of that when you're working remotely. What does a degree from MIT mean if you're working remotely? If you're taking it remotely, people would think that's insane, because it doesn't happen. I don't think any top 25 college will allow you to take everything remotely. I don't think any law school will, because it's the in-person interaction that matters. So if you're trying to work remotely, you're doing yourself way more harm than good, because you're not forming those in-person relationships, and you're not learning like you should. And it's those in-person relationships that are really going to help you and make you better. If I was an attorney coming out of law school now, and I had the choice of working in a huge, really good AmLaw firm or a really good boutique in the practice area I wanted to do, and even if they paid me $50,000 a year, and I was able to work with really good people, as opposed to working in a firm that paid 100. Obviously, these are much lower salaries that wouldn't give me that instruction. I probably would, knowing what I know now, I would choose the firm that pays less. So these are decisions that you need to make. But going to a firm where you're working face-to-face with people is going to make you into a different type of attorney than if you're working remotely. So you may think it's in your best interest to work remotely because of the freedom, but just at the end of the day, that freedom has a cost. And I would submit to you that cost is significant, because you're not learning everything you need to do. Just as if you were going remotely to a top school, you wouldn't learn from other people. I'll just tell you myself, I grew up in a family where there were no lawyers, and where, frankly, I was almost more interested in being a contractor than an attorney. But I became interested in being an attorney because I went to a school where all these people were trying to be attorneys and get into good schools. And I was like, hell, I'll compete with them. It's the same thing. And so I did everything I could to get the best grades and the best LSAT score and the activities and things that would make me look attractive. But it was because of the people I was around, and I was watching what they did, and they were feeding me with this is what you need to do to get ahead. That's what you get when you go to the best firm, is you get the same thing. And I would have, had I gone to some local school or worked remotely, or I wouldn't have gotten any of that. So that's what you get working in a firm. And I'm just trying to tell you how important it is to really think through this remote thing if you really want to be the best attorney you can be. And then also if you want to stay practicing law for the longest period of time. Very important. All right, so I'll take a quick break, and then I'll come back and answer questions. I'll just be gone 1 or 2 minutes. But I did want to apologize. I know this is a little bit of a long webinar, but I do think this is very important for you to factor in these questions to what you're doing, whether or not, and the type of jobs you're seeking, and what's going to happen to your career, because it does have profound implications and something you need to be very aware of. So I will be back in a minute or two, and then I'll take questions. I'll take as many questions as everyone has. So it doesn't have to be about this particular topic, but any questions you have, and I'll stay as long as I need to get everything answered. Thanks. All right. Thank you, everyone who's asking questions. This is very helpful. Let's see. Currently an executive in the healthcare life sciences sector. I have an opportunity to join a healthcare firm I had to practice law in my area of expertise. I haven't practiced law since I passed the bar 10 years ago. And also went to a Tier 4 law school. What should I consider in making the decision? I believe I'm a unique candidate in the market and can develop a specialty in this area of the law, but I worry that my law school will limit long-term career potential in a firm setting. Okay, that's a great question. The answer to that is, I've seen it's very common for attorneys without any experience in a law firm to go from an in-house setting to a law firm. And I've seen it quite a bit. It's very funny, but I had one time, and I think I've told the story before, but I'll just tell it again. I had a woman that was working in a hospital in some sort of healthcare legal setting, and she was moving to a firm in Colorado, and it was a good firm. It was a mid-sized firm, but a firm you probably would have heard of. And she got an interview with them, a phone interview, and when she had her husband on the phone, also asking questions. And when I heard this, she told me that her husband was asking questions. I was like, and she was older too. She was probably in her mid 50s and been working in a law firm for 30 years or whatever in a hospital. I couldn't believe it. I thought the firm would have absolutely no interest in her. But then they called back and they wanted to fly her out and interview her some more. So, I mean, there's a real demand for attorneys with certain backgrounds in healthcare law, even if they're in-house and have no longer law firm experience, to work in a law firm. I've seen more than any other practice area, people in healthcare law go to law firms from healthcare settings. It's a practice area where that just happens a lot, even with very good firms. I saw someone not too long ago make the transition to a really good firm, like a top 50 firm, in their 11th year of practice, have never worked in a law firm. So the concerns that anybody should have when they're trying to move to a law firm from an in-house position are really your expectations, meaning what do you expect from a work environment that you're in, and what are your habits, and can you break those habits? So an example was, I was mediation yesterday with a bank, and we were mediating this issue, and by the time it was 4 p.m., all these bankers started getting antsy, and we're like, okay, we're done. We want to go home, because bankers are used to going home at 4, and then they just tune out after 4. Now, this is not all bankers, but it was a credit union bank. And so this is just how it works. A lot of times people will have certain expectations if they're coming from an in-house environment versus a law firm environment. And then when they get to a law firm environment, all these things like hours, doing work that's highly valued by clients, double checking your work, deferring to senior or even junior attorneys, to yourself, all these things become very difficult for people. So the idea is you just have to be able to adapt and look at working in a law firm as a huge opportunity to increase your skills, become more of an expert, and then work very hard. Now, if you're hired after 10 or 11 years of practice in a law firm, they're hiring you not because they expect you to school them in your area of law or go out and get business. They're hiring you because they need someone with your skills working very hard probably on their matters and doing the best job you can. So you look at this as like a gift, and you don't look at it as something negative. And so a lot of people get into law firms from working in-house, and they see all these things that are wrong, but you have to actually look at it as a really good educational opportunity, because they're going to make you much better, and you need to follow the guidance you get very closely and just do the best you can. And the other thing that's hard for a lot of times for people to do is to change the quality of their work, the expectations. And so you need to really learn that as well as you can. And the nice thing is now that you have the law firm experience, if you're able to do that for 4 or 5 years, or, as long as you can, then you're probably going to be more employable to in-house employers or whatever you want in the healthcare industry than you otherwise would be. Okay, let's see here. Next question. Thank you for these generous, informative, and life-changing webinars. Oh, thank you. I was worried that this webinar, by the way, it's a lot of information, but I think it's very important. Okay, let's see here. Thank you for this question. The next person, and again, anyone that has questions, it doesn't have to be about working remotely, which can be about anything. I'm a data protection and technology lawyer who is, let me see, English qualified with 8, I'm just looking off to the side to a monitor. I apologize because my vision's not that great anymore. Who is an English and American qualified with 8 years experience. I've worked in-house for leading brands and law firms for the government, doing constitutional corporate work, IP negotiation, and litigation. How can I best position my overseas experience in the US market? Okay, so I had this discussion with attorneys, almost any attorney I talk to, whether they're overseas or in the US, I have this kind of discussion with them pretty much every week. And yesterday I had it with, it just is an ongoing, constant discussion. So how do you position your experience for the US market? The best way to position your experience is really to try to look like a specialist. So if you want to work in a law firm, most law firms are interested in specialists. And what that means is you really, if you're doing an IP and data protection technology lawyer, and that's all you've been doing, then that's great. But if you've been doing other practice areas, you really need to make sure you look like a specialist. The biggest problem with people that are moving from other practice settings is law firms believe that once you move in-house, once you move into the government, once you move to a public interest firm, that the odds are very poor that you will do well in a law firm. And why is that? It's because the last person that asked the last question was talking about getting hired by a law firm from a hospital or a healthcare setting. But it's very rare for attorneys to move from in-house positions back into law firms. It's just, or other practice settings. It's very rare. It's because the law firm believes that if you walk away from their business model, which is billing hours and hierarchical, and they believe that you will leave. And they're usually right. It's very rare that someone goes back to a law firm from another practice setting, with the exception of clerks that are clerking for judges or people that are certain specialties in-house and other things. It's very rare that people come back. Now, your particular practice area, data protection, it's certainly not impossible to do it because there's a lot of demand for that practice area, but it's more difficult because when you're coming from a different practice setting, it's just very difficult. And most of the time, law firms won't hire you, especially larger ones. It's almost, they say, once a pilot stops flying a large plane and they take a break, they never fly again. It's almost the same thing with leaving the law firm world. They know you'll leave again. And if you've been bouncing around to different types of employers, they assume that bouncing will continue. It's interesting, you look at resumes of attorneys, and so I was looking at a resume. I was talking to an attorney last week, I think it was on Friday, a really nice guy. And he started off at one of the best firms in the country. I think he'd gone to Harvard Law School, so he started the best firm in the country. And this is 30 years ago. And his resume was like 4 or 5 pages. And he moved to a new employer after 2 years, then a new employer after 2 years, so his resume was like 20 pages of these moves, not 20 pages, but you know what I mean. And so people have patterns. And so when a law firm is looking at your resume, they're looking to see what your patterns are. So how do you best position yourself? If you're 8 years out, I would recommend trying to make your resume say one thing, meaning nothing about, just don't go into any other practice areas than data protection, and then try to make your experience look very heavily law firm based as opposed to other issues. But the problem you're going to have is working in multiple practice settings and then also not even being in the United States. That's a huge problem. But if you look like a very strong data protection attorney and you're able to market yourself to firms, hopefully in a lot of different markets around the US, and decide if you're UBE qualified, I don't know how it works, or that you can waive into certain markets, you should be applying in those markets. And then you should try to probably apply to smaller to mid-sized firms that service businesses and lead with your data protection. Because if you take a market like Indianapolis, which is not a very small market, you may be able to very easily waive into Indiana. And then there's going to be firms there that may need someone like you that don't have anybody in Indianapolis. The same thing would go with your Madison, Wisconsin, then your Boulder, Colorado. So if you're able to find markets where there's a need for you, then they're going to be willing to overlook these different markets. Okay, how do I best communicate my legal experience in the US, England, and Asia in a way that translates to the US or international market? I deliver well in real life, but figuring out how to present myself resume and how to include work samples that speak to my true value. Okay, people are not just looking at the quality of your work. So that's the important thing to understand. They're looking at your quality of the types of decisions you've made about the direction of your career. So a lot of times, like people go to M programs all the time in the US from foreign countries, and the law firms believe that the person will probably go back to their home country. And so how long do we get them? And they're right. And so those are legitimate concerns. And figuring out how to present yourself, including work samples. Typically, the best way of doing that is you can have a representative matter sheet, a transaction sheet, which corporate attorneys do, and then you would attach that would not be part of your resume. You do not want to make all that part of your resume. You attach that as an attachment so you can show people all the representative matters you've worked on in this field. So you could say, helped a major company create a data protection policy, and you would go into detail about that instead of just listing all that in your resume. The problem with listing all that in your resume is it can get confusing, and especially if you've done it for a bunch of employers, that can get confusing as well. One thing I would potentially recommend to you that's an interesting thought is what you can do with your career is if it was me and your situation and you had all this international experience, and why would you go to work in a law firm? It seems to me like the companies would be much more interested in you because of your experience, and they would look at your in-house experience and your law firm experience as a plus, whereas law firms are going to be not as interested. So you would probably be more suited to working in a company or another practice setting that can use that experience and benefit from it than a law firm that's going to look at your career decisions through a light that wouldn't necessarily benefit you. Okay, I have several years as an independent lawyer, not sure whether to mention this on my resume. Okay, for the benefit of everyone, I always listing these. Will you do long-term? Can you be managed? Want the job? Want the job? Do we like you? So these are just some of the questions that law firms are asking, and most employers are when they're hiring you. They don't all ask this question, but most of the law firms do. What it means, will you do the job long term, means are you likely to stick around? Can you be managed? Means are you used to giving yourself orders, or do you take orders well from others? And so these are all the questions that you really want to have good answers to. And if you've worked independently, law firms and employers are going to basically reach the following conclusions. One, you don't like working with people and you feel more empowered working alone. That's one conclusion they'll reach. Another conclusion is that you may have been put in that situation because you were fired, or people didn't like the work quality you did, or didn't like your work quality, or you just didn't like working in offices or working with others and did your own thing. So these are all questions. So everyone needs to be able to answer these. And really the type of employer you will go to will be their tolerance for having good answers to these questions. And typically the largest and most prestigious firms are going to be the most discriminating with these questions. So can you do the job just means, do you have the skills and to do the work we have? And so that would be how you would take care of that in your transaction sheet and show them that. But we do the job long term. And what is someone supposed to think if you've had all these different jobs in different practice settings? They're just going to conclude that you're going to leave. And then can you be managed? Same thing. You worked alone. You've worked in all these different practice settings. You move, and then do you want the job and do we like you? So you can be the most likable person in the world, but if you don't answer all these questions well, then you can be in trouble. So that doesn't mean that you're not going to get hired. It just means you may have to look at more employers or newer firms that aren't going to ask this, or firms in geographic locations where this sort of information isn't really as important. Okay, let's see here. Sorry, give me a second to answer this. Okay, so I'll move on. Okay. Person says, interested in in-house startups and government, not law firms, a few years. Okay, so yeah, so if you're interested in house places, that's what I would recommend. Also, startups are great. That's a good idea. With startups, there's different types of startups. And this is a good question for anybody that wants to work at a startup. startups can be funded by venture capital firms and angel investors and have boards and that sort of thing. Those type of in-house startups are going to be much more difficult to get into because they're going to have typically law firms that they like to get people from, or they'll have different types of, and they'll know what they're doing. So they will ask all these questions. But a startup that's new that doesn't have that, it's funded itself, is fine. Those are much easier to get into than others. I had a funny experience happen, and this is humorous. I had a candidate that was in San Francisco. This is like when the internet boom was going on, like in 2000 or something. And they were interviewing with some big firms there, and I think they were from Boston or some big city. And they were interviewing from firms like corporate firms. And then one afternoon after an interview, they walked into a movie theater, and to their astonishment, there was an ad for an in-house counsel that played before the movie. And I don't know, I'm assuming there were a bunch of different ads, but they were, instead of rolling previews, they were just rolling something that said these local ads because there was so much demand. And so the person walked into this company after the movie and got hired. And I thought it was very funny. So depending on the type of startup, they can be very lenient and look at your experience in a different way than a law firm and then the level they hire you at, they may be interested in expanding internationally at some point. So that could help you. So that's a good question. Thank you. Okay. Next question. I also went to a lower ranked law school. What strategies can I assume that might exist and become a valuable asset to my firm and to become partner material and so forth? Okay, so law schools, that's a good question. People worry a lot of times about the quality of their law school or the ranking of the law school. And in reality, in the real world, once you get out, all the stuff about your law school becomes less important than these questions. If you have the experience in your practice area and you can do it, then most of the time, that's really the most important factor. The only thing that the law school really affects that much is if you're trying to work at firms, when does law school matter? Law school matter. It matters when you're a young attorney without experience, because this is the only thing you have to compete on. Only thing you have to compete on. So I hope that makes sense. Compete on, meaning you either went to a good law school or you didn't. If you didn't, how do you distinguish yourself for the top firms? So it's going to matter then when you get out of school. And then it matters if you're trying to work with firms with general counsel, with firms that represent companies with general counsels. And it doesn't even always matter there, but the reason that matters is because the general counsel of a company is going to look at the quality and the schools and things of the attorneys. So that's why big law firms, and they want to look really good because they represent companies. And so they want to look very strong to those companies. I mean, they're hiring the best people because they're charging these kind of outrageous rates for the services. So they need to have people that look very good, that look like they went to the best law schools. That's not to say that they never hire from the best law schools, but it is something that's important to them. So it matters if you're trying to work with firms that have hired companies with general counsel, and then it matters depending on the market you're in. So an example would be New York Law School, which is a good law school, but it's not ranked that high, but people can get jobs with huge firms in New York, and they do every year coming out of New York Law School. They get really good jobs, the people that do well. It's the same thing with even Southwestern in Los Angeles, or not a high-ranked law school, but people are getting jobs out of there every year, big firms in LA. If you want to go to work in a local firm, the law school matters, but not that much. I mean, they're expected to be hiring people from local law schools, and they do, even the best firms. Like even the top firms in New York, the very, very best firms will hire people from New York Law School and Pace Law School. They have people there that went there, and people did incredibly well there. But at the same time, they do. So that's when law school matters only when if you went to a local law school, it can become very hard to get a job out of state or in another market, because that there's no allegiance to people from that market, from the firms there. And that's really all that when law school matters. And then in law school, it doesn't matter if you get a job in a big firm at some point. It doesn't matter really anymore, because you're assumed to have gotten a training in a big firm, done well enough to get into a big firm. So law school only matters then, and then it does not matter really at all. It can, but it does not matter at all if you're working for most firms if you work for firms or want to work with firms that do not have, I don't know, my kids work with firms that don't work for companies with a general counsel. And what does that mean? It just means the firm's working directly for a company, typically entrepreneurs, local businesses, things like that. Local businesses, or individuals is a big one. People that don't go to top law schools in different markets typically will work for businesses or entrepreneurs, local businesses without general counsel, and individuals. And so that's honestly, that's probably 90% or more of all firms. Law school really doesn't matter. In my opinion, it doesn't. It only matters if you're trying to work at the largest, best firms. And it only matters if you didn't work at one of those firms after you graduated. Otherwise, it's not that big of a deal. And it also does not matter that much if you get a lot of business. And a lot of firms, I'll talk to people all the time that went to this terrible law school. I mean, when I say terrible, I don't mean terrible, but like, for example, there's people like Whittier Law School was a law school in California that was ABA approved, but then its bar rate went down to something just horrible, like 20%, and it had to go out of business. But you would find people from Whittier and very good firms all around LA as partners, and it's based in Orange County. And the reason is they'd been able to build books of business and became very valuable to their firms. And so again, a law school that's beyond fourth tier because it went out of business, it had to close, still attorneys with business, and partners at firms where they're making multi-million-dollar salaries. So honestly, it does matter, but if there's certain things you can do to overcome it, and it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so this person says, I have the ability to bring a business. It's what I do best. Yeah, so that's great. And sometimes law firms will hire people from in-house because they believe that the cost of bringing that person in is very low compared to the amount of business that they'll generate, and the risk of even that they'll generate the business. So law firms typically will hire two types of people, and I've brought this up before, but they'll hire soldiers and then general. A soldier is someone that will do the work, they'll bill the hours, they'll be manageable, they'll follow instructions, they won't make issues, and they'll just basic associates. And then generals are responsible for bringing in business, training, motivating people, hiring, all this sort of stuff, policies, procedures. So the worst thing that can happen is a law firm trying to hire a soldier and then the person deciding they're a general. That's very risky for firms. So that's one of the reasons why it can be very difficult to move from being a solo practitioner to working for a law firm, because a solo practitioner is a general. They have to do all this stuff on their own. And so when they move into a firm, the firm may just want a soldier. And if the person's a general, that can create problems. And then in some firms, it's interesting, some firms that have partnerships are not really partnerships because they're run by one general. And you have that with a lot of firms. That may be some guy that he started a firm and then he comes up with some compensation or some sort of method of hiring attorneys and paying them a percentage and using it. And so that can happen. One of the ways, the next question is, how do you highlight to potential employers, let me see here, that you can generate business? Let me see here. So one of the ways that's done, and the most common way, is a business plan. And this is historically been what attorneys do that don't currently have any business, or that have business and want to expand the business, or are coming from different practice saying, so put up a business plan. And the business plan is essentially what it's saying is it's saying that the person that I believe I can generate business. These are the contacts I have. This is how I'm going to do it. And then someone will read the business plan and decide whether or not they believe it. Now, if you have methods of potential clients, or you've done it before, or you have contacts that people that have told you they'll send you business, then yes, you should highlight that. And you should have a business plan. But how do you tell about the business plan? If you're applying to firms directly, you would just say, I have, if you like, I understand I don't currently have any business, but I also have a business plan where I believe I can generate this amount of money in the next 5 years in business, and I'd love to share it with you confidentially or something like that. That would be how you would talk about that. And then how do you write a business plan? Everyone does them their own way. But at this point, you could probably use ChatGPT to, I don't know, or Bard or something. Google. There's all sorts of ways to write a business plan, but you would basically find a sample business plan and then work that and do that. So this is historically what attorneys have done. Does it work? Yeah, it can work, but most law firms are smart enough to know that if you don't currently have business, the odds are that you're going to have a hard time getting business in the future. And law firms that hire people based on business plans are usually disappointed, meaning disappointed probably 80% of the time, maybe 85%, because a lot of times people don't have it. But if you have a real legitimate business plan or real legitimate ways to generate business, then I would put it in a cover letter and highlight it there. I wouldn't put it on my resume because it looks a little funky, but I would definitely put it in a cover letter. And if somebody reads the cover letter, then it could be very helpful for you. Okay, let me see here. Yeah, there's more questions. Those are all good questions. Again, if anybody has any more questions, okay, let's see. How do law firms typically determine whether to adopt a remote or in-office work model? There's a lot of questions that go into it, or a lot of issues. It really depends on the firm. How do they determine it? It's usually the law firm management will help determine it, and the law firm management will debate all these things we're talking about, like our brand, our learning, hours, profitability. They'll look at all these factors and think about it. They'll also, frankly, look at the office space cost, because office space is a huge cost for a lot of firms. And then you need all sorts of different types of people working in an office than you would, or working in office space than you necessarily would to work in an office than you would if it's remote. So all your cost when you work in an office, people working in an office go up. A lot of law firms pay for parking. If you think about it, if you're a big law firm, that could be tens of thousands of dollars per month. They have to pay janitorial staff. They have to pay security. There's all sorts of cost that a law firm has. So this is how they make the decisions, and they make it based on those factors. And it depends on the size firm, and it depends on a lot of different factors. But that's how they decide it. So. Okay, let's see here. Because here's just the client relationships. I'll answer that real briefly. So typically what law firms are doing, when a law firm relocates to Silicon Valley from New York or opens an office there, the reason they're doing that is because they want to be close to clients. They want to be able to run by the office. If there's issues, they're trying to be close to the clients. And if you're working, and the reason is because that's their job. They work for the clients. It's no different than setting up a hospital in a certain area because the hospital wants to get people locally to come in, or a funeral home or whatever. It's just, that's what the business is dependent on, being close to their clients. With Zoom and all these sorts of things, that may not matter as much anymore, but it still matters. The most successful lawyers, I think, spend a lot of time going out and meeting with attorneys and forming personal relationships, and meeting with clients and forming personal relationships. There's just a lot more that happens when you're in person. So I think that being able to be in an office is more helpful for clients. And this is a attorney-client relationship. And then you also asked about collaboration. Yeah, so I think I talked a lot about collaboration, but I think it definitely can negatively affect collaboration in law firms. Let's see here. Any questions? Let's see. Okay, this person says I could generate business in 90 days if I'm hired on a temp basis. Okay, that's good. All right, I think that's about it for questions. I certainly appreciate all the questions there. I apologize if it was kind of a little long webinar. I think the topic is very interesting, and I felt it was necessary to do because it does really have a lot of impact on your career, and people don't realize it. There's always these kind of little things that can make a big difference. This is one of them. Frankly, it's not an easy topic to talk about because it's just, I guess it's easy, but in terms of things that are interesting to an audience, I don't know if it's the most interesting, but I do feel it was important because it's coming up a lot, and I'm seeing a lot of people get jobs working remotely that they otherwise wouldn't get. But I'm also seeing a lot of people lose jobs or have career problems because of their unwillingness to go into the office. So it's a big deal, and it's a very important issue right now. Thank you. And I will be next week, and I'll hopefully have a more interesting topic than this. I think it's interesting, but I mean for you. And then also we're getting close to the third quarter. What I do at the beginning of each quarter is I do a resume workshop, which is a lot of fun. And then I also do in addition to a resume workshop, I also do a cover letter workshop where we go over that. We'll start sending out emails and things to the people that have been on these calls, which is a lot. And then if you send in your stuff for those, when we schedule those, we'll do them in a call. Those are typically very long webinars. They can be like, 4 to 6 hours, but they're very useful. And you can view replays of them too that we put up, which is also helpful. Thanks again. And I will talk to everyone next week.